Hola a todos, muy buenas tardes. Sean todos ustedes bienvenidos a este 15º Coloquio Internacional Malcolm Lowry. Estamos muy contentos por recibirlos el día de hoy aquí en su casa, en Días de Muertos. Les saluda a su amigo Alberto Rebollo de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry, con sede en la Ciudad de México y en Cuernavaca, Morelos. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a este 15º Coloquio Internacional Malcolm Lowry 2020, Pandemonium, el Día de Muertos más grande del siglo, que por primera vez se realiza de manera virtual y que está transmitiéndose en vivo y en directo por nuestra página de Facebook. Normalmente, desde el 2002, celebramos casi cada año un evento de este tipo. Sin embargo, en esta ocasión, pues debido a la pandemia del COVID-19, nos vimos en la necesidad de organizarlo por estos medios. De cualquier forma, nos declaramos listos y purificados para recibir el espíritu del profeta Malcolm Lowry, que esperamos y creemos firmemente que de alguna forma se nos va a manifestar en este 15º coloquio y nos dará su venia para esta gran celebración mundial en su honor. Una vez al año los muertos viven un día. Oh, vuelve a mí como aquella vez en mayo, decía el cónsul desesperadamente a Ivonne en Bajo el Volcán. Quiero aprovechar la ocasión para mencionar que todo esto es gracias al inagotable entusiasmo del camarada Óscar Menéndez de Cuernavaca, al profundo apasionamiento de Felix Garcia de Casaxitla, a la frenética y siempre poética insistencia de Marcelo Texeira desde Lisboa, Portugal, al permanente apoyo de Andy Smith desde San Francisco, California, a la incondicional prestancia de Dany de París, Francia, al apoyo y gran talento plástico de Alejandro Aranda desde Cuernavaca y al entusiasmo de tantos otros compañeros como los feministas de Feminists de Liverpool, al amigo Chris Ackerley de Nueva Zelanda, que aquí nos acompaña también, al entrañable camarada Stephen Cooper de Los Ángeles, California, gracias también a la idea original de mi querido maestro Hernán Lara Zavala, quien me sugirió por primera vez, allá hace como 20 años, la organización de este tipo de coloquios. Evidentemente también a la memoria de nuestro entrañable amigo Raúl Ortiz, traductor de Bajo el Volcán al español, quien siempre pues nos brindó su amistad, su mano amiga, por aquí nos acompaña el día de hoy también en la ofrenda, junto con Óscar Chávez y otros compañeros que se nos han adelantado en el camino. Y bueno, gracias a un largo etcétera de compañeros de todo el mundo que en su momento han aportado un granito de arena para que estos eventos de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry se lleven a cabo. Estoy seguro que en el futuro se seguirán sumando nuevas luminarias de todo el mundo. Gracias a todas y todos ustedes. A continuación, los miembros de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry van a hacer una breve presentación personal. Al terminar, vamos a anunciar el programa general de los 3 días que dura el coloquio. El día de hoy, sábado 31 de octubre, mañana domingo 1 de noviembre y lunes 2 de noviembre. Estos contarán con la participación de grandes escritores, poetas, músicos, pintores, cineastas y especialistas de primera línea a nivel mundial en la vida y la obra de novelista, poeta y profeta Malcolm Lowry. Vamos a continuar pues con la participación de nuestro querido amigo y camarada Dany Hurpin. Adelante, Dany. Gracias.
Pues gracias, Alberto. Queridos amigos de la Fundación y del mundo que nos están viendo, es un placer enorme estar aquí hoy y poder transmitir desde Cuernavaca, esta bella ciudad que inspiró tanto a nuestro gran Malcolm Lowry. Ahora el coloquio se hace online cuando normalmente lo hacemos en el Museo de la Casona Spencer, en el centro de la ciudad. Llegamos al 15º encuentro y ese número siempre tiene un valor especial en México. Y hay que saludar la iniciativa que se hizo hace 18 años, en 2002, cuando se organizó el primer encuentro aquí en Cuernavaca y después la creación de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry, que permitió darle continuidad al esfuerzo de promover e intercambiar acerca de la obra de Lowry. También la creación de la página internet de la Fundación en 2007 fue una gran idea, porque permitió a muchísimas personas en el mundo tener más información sobre Cuernavaca, Lowry y los encuentros que hemos organizado a lo largo de esos años. Nos ha permitido también recibir aquí a muchísimos visitantes de todo el mundo que vienen a ver nuestra ciudad a través de los ojos de Malcolm Lowry. En 2012 decretamos como lugar sagrado y de peregrinación la Cantina de la Estrella. Aquí la ven, lugar que nos adoptó, y quiero aprovechar este momento para saludar a don Beto y agradecer su disposición a recibirnos siempre. Ese lugar ahora está cerrado por la COVID, pero esperemos que pueda abrir pronto para poder reunirnos ahí, ya que ese espacio es nuestra segunda casa. El año pasado también tuvimos la fortuna de poder organizar el coloquio en Lisboa, gracias al esfuerzo y organización de nuestro querido Marcelo. Ahora tenemos la dicha de contar con grandes especialistas de Lowry, como lo son Cheryl Grace de Canadá, Chris Ackerley de Nueva Zelanda, Nigel Foxcroft y Brian Biggs de Inglaterra, y Hernán Lara Zavara de México. Enhorabuena por ese nuevo encuentro, que lo disfrutemos mucho. Las sesiones quedarán grabadas en Facebook y también en el canal de YouTube de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry. Salud y saludos, amigos, y enhorabuena. Y ahorita sigue nuestro amigo Óscar, por favor.
Óscar Menéndez, adelante, compañero.
Bueno, estamos muy contentos de estar en esta especie de mundial de Malcolm Lowry. Es un evento prácticamente, pues, como los Juegos Olímpicos o como el campeonato de fútbol, porque ya nos podemos extender a todo el mundo a contar que tenemos, pues, a nuestro profeta, a Malcolm Lowry, y que partimos de una idea muy concreta, ¿no? Nosotros vivimos en Cuernavaca. Yo, muy joven, comencé a leer Bajo el Volcán y me emocionó tanto que me vine a Cuernavaca a hacer la película sobre Malcolm Lowry que se llamó Malcolm Lowry en México. En esta película queríamos representar el texto de Malcolm Lowry referente a México. Entonces, en los textos de Lowry, que leímos toda la obra de él, pudimos ubicar las frases claves sobre lo que significaba México para Malcolm. Entonces entendimos que era el mejor escritor que había en México, que había narrado realmente la historia de México, mezclada con esta gran bebida, con el mezcal y con los elementos prehispánicos de México. Realmente, pues, fue muy emocionante porque nos dieron el Premio Nacional de Periodismo en esa etapa, en los 1989. Entonces, pudimos pasar este film en Palacio de Bellas Artes de México. Llamó mucho la atención y reunió a muchísimas gentes que ya adoraban a Malcolm, o que no los conociéramos, pero levantamos una especie de nueva lectura sobre Malcolm gracias a este material fílmico, ¿no? Ahora, pues, queremos decirle a ustedes que estamos muy contentos de estar desde Cuernavaca narrando este evento que está dentro del Día de Muertos, que es el día que nosotros tenemos como arranque para el 2 de noviembre, como arranque a todas las festividades sobre Malcolm Lowry. Es el Día de Muertos donde comienza la gran novela de Bajo el Volcán. Entonces, en México tiene toda una gama muy grande cultural sobre la muerte como resurrección. Entonces, como resurrección, pues les voy a mostrar a Ivonne. Ivonne nos va a acompañar en este momento. Aquí está Ivonne, que vino desde Ultratumba a festejar con nosotros. Ivonne, platícale a los muchachos que estás muy contenta de estar con nosotros. Sí, very good for me. Muy bien. Hablas muy rápido, no te entendemos. Otra vez, por favor. Very good this holiday. About my friend, my querido Malcolm. Sí, muy bien, muchacha, muy bien.
Oye, perdón, yo soy hijo de Óscar.
Síguele.
No, ya.
Síguele, Emiliano, pues estás interrumpiendo ahí.
Oigan, yo estoy escuchando aquí la conversación. ¿Podrían hablar alguna frase o algo evocativo de Bajo el Volcán que me inspire, porque luego se pierde un poco la idea, ¿no? De quién es el autor de cuál estamos hablando. O sea, en años vamos a estar hablando de Kurt Cobain o algo así. O de...
Bueno, los jóvenes también les interesa mucho, como se puede dar cuenta. De todas maneras, pues yo me protejo como cineasta y también vino una amiga mía, cineasta, a estar con nosotros. Es ella, Mrs. Cámara. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Estás bien? Me da gusto que hayas venido con tu cámara. A ver si nos puedes fotografiar a todos. Bueno, ya les tomó la foto mi amiga cámara. ¿Listo? Bueno, tenemos que entender que la muerte jugamos con ella. Hacemos elementos, esculturas, dibujos, todo es en relación a que regresan los muertos otra vez con nosotros a estar en estos días acompañando a los vivos. Entonces, bueno, por último quiero agradecer, pues de veras muy sentidamente a Marcelo, a Marcelo por su gran labor que realizó en Lisboa. Resulta que hicimos el año pasado el coloquio de Lisboa y Marcelo se encargó totalmente de pues darnos ese gran apoyo que consiguió con la clase cultural y las bases culturales de Lisboa. Entonces nos acompañaron poetas, pintores y mucha gente de Lisboa que hizo un gran evento esta estancia del grupo mexicano que fuimos a Lisboa a celebrar el 14 Coloquio Malcolm Lowry. Marcelo, muchas gracias, te lo digo otra vez, hiciste un gran papel en tu tierra, que es bellísima, además, debemos todos regresar a Lisboa. Bueno, con esto ya avancé en mi presentación y sigamos. ¿Quién va?
Andrew.
Audio. ¿Quién sigue?
Sí. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And when Alberto invited me to introduce and to have a conversation with Chris Ackerley, I couldn't have been happier. I was delighted. Chris and I have become, well, to take a step back, when I first read Under the Volcano, I realized there was a lot there. When I finally got Chris Ackerley's companion to Under the Volcano, it very clearly quantified how much was there. You'll learn a little bit more about him as we go forward, but Chris, the annotations and research that Chris has done into the works of Malcolm Lowry, to me, are nothing short of astounding. And I've been very pleased that since the first colloquium in Cuernavaca, that Chris and I have become friends. And we've actually met up several times, one time even in Las Vegas, that great hub of Lowry scholarship. Anyway, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Ackerley. I think his reputation precedes him. And Chris, how are you?
I am fine, thank you very, very much, Andy. And I'd just like to say thank you for the nice words, but also for the fact that you've hosted me at your house 2 or 3 times, and if there's anything that I'm very envious in return, is that you've got first editions of both Ultramarine and Under the Volcano, and I'd quite happily swap a first edition of my annotations for either of those.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly how I got those. It was good luck, I think. Well, so today what we're going to do is as long as everybody agrees, is I thought we'd talk a little bit more about some of the more recent work that you've been doing, because it's pretty fascinating. And I've got some notes here. I'll refer to them, so I don't pretend to have a memory that I can remember everything. But so I think for all of us, one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is the discovery of in ballast to the White Sea, which I think came from the Jan Gabrielle estate, and nobody really knew it existed until it turned up after she passed away. Then I had the pleasure, I read an article that Chris did about that particular, about in ballast. And actually it was really going over the type of evidence that a true annotator would use when looking at this type of material. Chris, would you want to talk a little bit?
Sorry, Andrew. Right now, just the global presentation of the foundation. You know.
What's that?
So, sorry, but you are going too quick. Right now, just the presentation of the foundation. Oh,
okay. Well, so we don't want to proceed with the questions? I guess I'm confused.
No, you will be in the second part of today.
Okay.
After the movie, after Oscar movie, after
okay, all right.
Done with the presentation.
Sorry,
guys.
Ahead of it. Sorry about that.
Absolutely fine.
Continuamos con Marcelo Texeira, por favor.
Okay, Marcelo.
Boa noite desde Lisboa. Um abraço a todos os companheiros da Fundação Malcolm Lowry que estão no México e em todas as partes do mundo que nos estão a acompanhar. Um abraço também a todos os lorianos que, de uma forma ou de outra, vêm acompanhando o trabalho que temos vindo a realizar ao longo destes anos. É um prazer renovado este encontro, este reencontro que anualmente promovemos. E, Óscar, muchas gracias por tus palabras sobre el evento del año pasado. No ano passado realizámos o 14º Coloquio Internacional aqui em Lisboa. Foi, podemos dizê-lo, um êxito. Estamos a finalizar um livro com as atas do encontro. Foi um encontro que deu também origem a um DVD gravando todas as intervenções que tiveram lugar durante os 2 dias do colóquio. E este ano, naturalmente, é um ano especial, por várias razões que já foram aqui referidas. Primeiro, pelas circunstâncias de, pela primeira vez, não podermos estar reunidos presencialmente, devido à pandemia que todos atravessamos. Depois, porque também pela primeira vez, e como consequência disso, este encontro é um encontro virtual, o que tem a vantagem de conseguir congregar pessoas de lugares mais distantes que, noutras circunstâncias, não teriam possibilidade de estar presentes. O Alberto vai, de seguida, apresentar com mais pormenor o programa, mas atrevo-me a dizer que este será um dos grandes colóquios que nós já promovemos. Teremos connosco, ao longo destes 3 dias, alguns dos mais reputados especialistas mundiais que se têm debruçado sobre a obra e a vida de Malcolm Lowry, de várias partes do mundo. Temos especialistas convidados, amigos no fundo, lorianos, do Canadá, dos Estados Unidos, de Inglaterra, da Nova Zelândia. Todos eles vêm partilhar não apenas o seu saber e o resultado das suas descobertas e do seu estudo entusiasta ao longo de muitos anos de trabalho, como vem também seguramente deliciar-nos com as conferências que vão apresentar. Recordar que este evento começa hoje, continua amanhã e na próxima segunda-feira. portanto, 9 horas de Lisboa, 3 horas do México, sempre à mesma hora. Contamos com a sua presença, acompanhe-nos, temos a certeza de que irão gostar como nós gostamos. E passo a palavra agora ao maestro Aranda, Alejandro Aranda, que é pintor, é o autor, nos últimos anos tem sido o autor dos cartazes evocativos destes encontros e realizou para este ano também um cartaz maravilhoso. Alejandro Aranda é um pintor muito conhecido, muito reconhecido, um grande maestro gravador. Aranda, por favor.
Gracias, Marcelo. Hola a todas y todos. Soy Alejandro Aranda, miembro de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry y autor del cartel de promoción del 15º Coloquio Internacional Malcolm Lowry 2020. Por azares del destino, Malcolm Lowry llegó a México por el puerto de Acapulco el 2 de noviembre de 1937, Día de Muertos. Vivió en Cuernavaca y con gran intuición se inspiró en nuestra cultura ancestral, Cuauhnáhuac, el Día de Muertos, el mezcal, las barrancas y el Popocatépetl para escribir su gran novela Bajo el Volcán. Como artista plástico que soy, he venido realizando grabados e ilustraciones sobre la novela Bajo el Volcán y las presento durante la fiesta de Día de Muertos en exposiciones efímeras. También he diseñado e ilustrado algunos carteles para los coloquios organizados por la Fundación. El cartel de este año es una mezcla de nuestras tradiciones y está contextualizado con lo que nos ha tocado vivir hoy, la pandemia del COVID-19 que pone en riesgo nuestras vidas. Nuestra cultura ancestral nos ha enseñado a reírnos de la muerte con humor e irreverencia, y este cartel tiene algo de ello, la calaca pandémica mundial, con los ojos desorbitados, llenos de espanto, y el cráneo con un mapamundi que significa la expansión de la pandemia en todos los rincones del orbe. En su cubrebocas está México y en el centro una minúscula mancha, el estado de Morelos, lugar de convergencia de este encuentro. El cráneo está circundado con una línea blanca que representa la comunicación virtual con 6 monitores como aureolas que simbolizan la procedencia de los participantes: México, Estados Unidos, Canadá, Nueva Zelanda, Inglaterra, Francia y Portugal. Las pantallas son la conexión visual con el mundo y en ellas hay calacas con diferentes estados de ánimo y humor. Los enamorados de la novela, los apasionados, los estudiosos de la vida y de la obra de Malcolm Lowry, los reflexivos ante la vida y la muerte, los defensores de Lowry, los que dudan y los que no entienden nada. Finalmente vuelan y llegan a nuestras casas las ánimas de nuestros queridos difuntos y los recibimos con flores de cempasúchil, pan, mezcal, viandas de lo que más les gustaba en vida. Rica tradición que alimenta nuestro imaginario popular en México por siempre. Muchas gracias.
Bien.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro Aranda, compañero artista plástico que nos acompaña con sus carteles siempre. Vamos a presentar de manera general el programa de los 3 días. Muy brevemente, el día de hoy vamos a proceder con el video de Óscar Menéndez, que nos va a hacer el favor de presentar. Posteriormente vendrá la entrevista con Andrew Smith, que le va a realizar al doctor Chris Ackerley, de la Universidad de Otago, Nueva Zelanda. Y ahí cerraríamos con una ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Los compañeros que nos están viendo a través del Facebook quieren preguntarle tanto al maestro Óscar Menéndez como al final de la charla que vamos a tener con el doctor Chris Ackerley. Pueden poner sus preguntas ahí en el Facebook. Nosotros se las vamos a hacer llegar a los ponentes. El día de mañana a las 3 de la tarde, hora del centro de México, del Popocatépetl, iniciamos con la presentación de el compañero Brian Biggs. Él es director artístico del Blue Coat Art Center de Liverpool. Él también va a estar acompañado de John Hyatt y Aisla Cox. John Hyatt es un músico del grupo los Tres Johns, y también la maestra Aisla Cox, quien es una poetisa de allá de Liverpool, también de Inglaterra. Terminando la presentación de Brian Biggs, vamos a pasar a alrededor de las 4 de la tarde con una entrevista al maestro Hernán Lara Zavala de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, y la va a realizar el compañero Marcelo Texeira. Él va a ser el encargado de hacer la entrevista con Hernán Lara. Al final igual habrá una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Para los compañeros que nos acompañan en el Facebook, pueden poner sus preguntas ahí en el chat. Ahí nosotros le haremos llegar sus preguntas. Y para terminar el día lunes 2 de noviembre, a las 3 de la tarde, hora del Iztaccíhuatl, hora central de México. Ahí vamos a tener la participación del doctor Nigel Foxcroft de la Universidad de Brighton, de East Sussex, allá en Inglaterra. Él va a dar una conferencia y al final también tendremos una ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Alrededor de las 4 de la tarde vamos a tener una entrevista con la doctora Cheryl Grace de la Universidad de British Columbia en Vancouver. Ella es especialista top del más alto nivel, especialista en la obra y la vida de Malcolm Lowry. Ella ha tenido acceso a todos los archivos, expedientes y cartas, borradores de las novelas de Malcolm Lowry que están allá en la Universidad de British Columbia. Ella tiene toda esa información. Yo voy a hacer la entrevista, su servidor Alberto Rebollo, y al final pues ustedes podrán hacer preguntas a través del Facebook. Eso será pues el lunes 2 de noviembre, y con eso estaríamos cerrando. Ya nada más para presentar por parte de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry un DVD y un libro, Memorias de Lisboa, un libro referente al coloquio, 14 coloquios del año pasado allá en Lisboa, Portugal, a cargo del Pleno de la Fundación Malcolm Lowry. Finalizaremos con un brindis de honor con mezcal del cónsul, desde luego. Y bueno, todos los que no puedan conseguir mezcal, pues se aceptará pues whisky, pulque y cualquier otra bebida espirituosa que puedan conseguir por allá, por sus países o donde nos escuchen. Bueno, ese es el programa general. Muchas gracias. Vamos a darle la palabra al compañero Óscar Menéndez, camarada cineasta, quien nos va a presentar su video referente a Bajo el Volcán, Malcolm Lowry, y el traductor Raúl Ortiz y Ortiz. Adelante, Óscar, camarada, por favor.
Bien, muy brevemente, este fragmento que vamos a presentar corresponde a un pequeño documental que hicimos para reducir un poco la historia y presentarla más concretamente, ¿no? Esto se llama Cuernavaca está bajo el volcán. Presenta pues escenas clásicas de la novela, ¿no? Está el Casino de la Selva, están los volcanes, desde luego, y está la estación de ferrocarril que él menciona en la novela, y está la casa donde vivió y escribió la novela de Bajo el Volcán, con un texto bellísimo de Emilia Ruizki, que fue la que hizo el guión original de este trabajo. Entonces, adelante con Cuernavaca y los volcanes. Dany.
Vamos, voy.
Dos cadenas montañosas atraviesan la República, aproximadamente de norte a sur, formando entre sí valles y planicies. Ante uno de esos valles, dominado por dos volcanes, se extiende a 2000 metros sobre el nivel del mar la ciudad de Cuauhnáhuac. Queda situada bastante al sur del Trópico de Cáncer. Para ser exactos, en el paralelo 19, casi a la misma latitud en que se encuentran, al oeste, en el Pacífico, las islas de Revillagigedo, o mucho más hacia el oeste, el extremo más meridional de Hawái, y hacia el este, el puerto de Tsukoc, en el litoral atlántico de Yucatán, cerca de la frontera de Honduras británica, o mucho más hacia el este, en la India, la ciudad de Yugarnó, en la bahía de Bengala. Los muros de la ciudad, construida en una colina, son altos. Las calles y veredas, tortuosas y accidentadas. Una carretera amplia y hermosa, de estilo norteamericano, entra por el norte y se pierde en estrechas callejuelas, para convertirse al salir en un sendero de cabras. Tiene 18 iglesias y 57 cantinas. También se enorgullece de su campo de golf, de multitud de espléndidos hoteles y de no menos de 400 albercas públicas y particulares, colmadas por la lluvia que incesantemente se precipita de las montañas. En las afueras de la ciudad, cerca de la estación del ferrocarril, se yergue, en una colina ligeramente más alta, el Hotel Casino de la Selva. Está situado bastante lejos de la carretera principal y lo rodean jardines y terrazas que, en cualquier dirección, dominan un amplio panorama. Aunque palaciego, lo invade cierta atmósfera de desolado esplendor, porque ya no es un casino. Ni siquiera se puede apostar a una partida de dados las bebidas que se consumen en el bar. Lo rondan fantasmas de jugadores arruinados. Nadie parece nadar jamás en su espléndida piscina olímpica. Vacíos y funestos están los trampolines, los frontones desiertos, invadidos de hierba. Solo 2 campos de tenis se mantienen en buen estado durante la temporada. Hacia la hora del crepúsculo de Día de Muertos, en noviembre de 1939, 2 hombres, vestidos de franela blanca, estaban sentados bebiendo anís en la terraza principal del casino.
En noviembre de 1936, llega a México, descubriendo que Cuernavaca posee un universo de símbolos que despiertan su creación literaria. Surge así el cuento Bajo el Volcán, que posteriormente llegará a ser su máxima obra. México tiene el encanto que Lowry necesita para plasmar su mundo que hasta nuestros días resulta único. La fuerza y el colorido. Su obsesiva introspección, el exceso de sus ensoñaciones persecutorias, el mezcal y el tequila, el paisaje y los enormes volcanes que le hacen presentir que se halla en el centro del mundo.
Podemos considerar a México como el mundo o el jardín del Edén, o como ambas cosas a la vez. También como una especie de símbolo intemporal del mundo en el que es posible colocar el jardín del Edén, la Torre de Babel. De hecho, todo lo que nos dé la gana.
Dice Lowry.
México es paradisíaco e indudablemente Iztaccíhuatl y el Popocatépetl, aquella imagen del matrimonio perfecto, se alzaban ahora claros y hermosos. bajo un cielo matutino de pureza casi íntegra. Lejos, por encima de su cabeza, algunas nubes blancas perseguían ágiles a una luna pálida y jorobada. Bebe toda la mañana, le decían. Bebe todo el día. Esto es vivir. Atravesó la calle con rumbo a la estación. Aunque no iba a marcharse por ferrocarril, ante la idea de la partida, de su inminencia, nuevamente le invadió abrumadora tristeza. Y evitando puerilmente las agujas, siguió por los rieles. Los rayos del sol poniente rebotaban en los tanques de petróleo que se hallaban en el pasto del andén. La estación dormitaba. Las vías estaban desiertas. Poco de cuanto en ella había daba idea de que alguna vez allí llegara un tren, por no decir que de allí saliera.
Silenciosa y eclipsada, la casa permanece. No importa la hora. Allí está. Sus goznes chirrian a la par que la melancólica cantata de los grillos. El viento mece metódicamente los pensamientos. El polvo acumulado en todos sus rincones hace surgir la imagen imprecisa de la muerte que ronda. Nada se ha extinguido. La base en la que se creó bajo el volcán permanece, ya que es imposible cortar el círculo de la eternidad. El agua estancada empapa las fibras de la desolación, y el aullido humano parece indicar que todo sigue igual, que el infierno proviene de uno mismo y que el alma inmortal se transmite de uno a otro ser. En el reflejo permanece la idea. La terrible nostalgia no cesa de brotar.
Terminar una obra dando la interpretación de un espacio hospitalario, de un clima paradisíaco que lo lleva a comparar la capital del estado de Morelos al jardín del paraíso terrenal, donde en el siglo XX, a través de la acción de la novela, vamos a ver de qué manera cae el nuevo Adán y en su caída arrastra a su compañera. Lowry, a mi juicio, es un autor que merecería tener un monumento, porque gracias a él, Cuauhnáhuac llega a ser colocado en el panorama de la literatura universal como el Dublín de Joyce o como el París de Zola o de Marcel Proust, como el Madrid del Galdós de Fortunata y Jacinta. Debería ser Cuernavaca la patria a donde todos los que saben que no se puede vivir sin amar acuden en busca de paz, de armonía y de tranquilidad.
Muy bien, Óscar, muy bien.
Bien, dígale. Bien, pues acabamos de ver un fragmento de Cuernavaca también. Importante situar el espacio, la arquitectura, la naturaleza, los volcanes, pues que vio que fue lo que hizo que Malcolm se enamorara de Cuernavaca, como muchos otros escritores y muchos otros artistas que han convivido con nosotros aquí en Cuernavaca. Realmente tenemos mucha suerte en esta ciudad porque han venido los principales actores de la cultura mundial a Cuernavaca. Y tenemos también esa gran migración de los perseguidos políticos y sobre todo del macartismo. Estuvieron aquí prácticamente todos los artistas exiliados de Howard Foster, mucha gente más estudió aquí en Cuernavaca y escribió sobre Cuernavaca. Entonces, bueno, somos una ciudad privilegiada en este país, en que han podido venir prácticamente pues toda la intelectualidad del mundo entero, desde Asia, Europa, América, aquí han residido en nuestra ciudad. Yo creo que es muy estimulante y sobre todo, pues Malcolm, que nos representa.
Merde, tu vas payer. Muy bien, pues igual si hay más preguntas, podemos ver después de la charla que van a tener Andrew Smith ahorita con Chris Ackerley.
That was a great presentation and the film, and I agreed that Cuernavaca is a very special place. And just for my part, I actually read the book Under the Volcano while I was in Cuernavaca many years ago. So for me, the book and the city are completely intertwined. But anyway, back to Chris. If you've never had a chance to look at the companion to Under the Volcano, I recommend that you do that. There's now a hypertext version online via the University of Otago. So if you look for the Under the Volcano, a hypertextual companion, I think you'll be amazed at the amount of information that's there. Chris, I would call him an annotator par excellence. And so, yes, it's great to restart here our conversation. So Chris, what we were talking about, where I was sort of going off on a tangent, but for me, one of the most exciting things is the discovery of In Ballast to the White Sea, which was a work that we thought was lost. Turned out that it was in Jan Gabriel's care all that time and came to light, I think, about 10, 15 years ago. Now, I think that sort of restarted a lot of your research into some of the Norwegian locations that appear in that book. And I wondered if you would care to tell us a little bit about what you study or what you discovered when you went to Norway, and maybe more about In Ballast specifically.
Oh, well, with pleasure. Thank you, Andy. I mean, a number of details will come out as a result of the subsequent questions, because we're working on this question and answer system, which I think is good. But can I just say one or two things first? First of all, unfortunately, I've retired from the university, and one of the casualties is that my website there has been basically disconnected. So to find the hypertext version of the commentary, you just need, I think you need to Google it, unfortunately, put my name in and then Malcolm Lowry project or hypertext. It's there, with the exception of the first page for some reason. So I will have to find a way of restoring that and possibly setting it up as an independent site. Secondly, on that first page, which is now missing, I had a dedication to Raul, who we saw just a few moments ago, and I just want to pay tribute to him. I was so sorry to hear that he had died. I stayed with him 2 or 3 times in Mexico. He was a lovely man, a scholar, a gentleman, and a very good friend. So I've dedicated the website to him, and I just want to repeat that dedication. So what's the best way of starting to begin? Well, I can talk about, I think, the volume of essays that came from a Liverpool conference in 2017, where people like Brian Biggs and Helen Tukey, who edited this. Can I hold this up? Does this appear, this volume? Can you see that? Remaking the Voyage. It's a volume of essays, the first to be actually dedicated to In Ballast to the White Sea, which, as Andy says, just basically was a very, very recent production. I worked with Pat McCarthy, who was a superb person to work with. He was the editor, I was the annotator, and our paths actually crossed. I think I helped out with the editing, and he certainly helped out with the annotation. So it was very, very much a joint exploration and a very nice collaboration in that sense. Now, my essay for the volume, edited by Brian and Helen, was a result of being invited to Norway to help out with some PhD students over there. They paid my way over and they put me up for about 6 weeks, which was extremely kind of them, particularly considering the price of things in Norway. And as a result, I had a lot of time to follow up the mystery of Lowry's voyage to Norway, something that even his brother Russell didn't know. I think to the end of his life denied that it had even taken place. The family didn't know about it. He kept it to himself. It is not mentioned in Douglas Day's biography, but it is mentioned for 3 or 4 pages in Gordon Barker's biography. And when I got to Norway, I realized that there was a big problem with the official biography by Gordon Barker, because clearly a lot of the work had been done from the text of In Ballast and not from, shall we say, the legwork of walking around the places in Norway where Lowry had actually been. Now, what seems to have happened is that he had got a copy of the typescript from Jan Gabriel. He was friends with Jan, and Jan wasn't telling the world about this, because at this stage, I think Marjorie Lowry was still alive. And Jan, I think, was very much afraid that if the news about a copy of this missing manuscript emerged, then Marjorie would demand to have it as the executor of Malcolm's will. And she and Jan and Marjorie did not get on at all. So I think basically Jan hung on to it, did not tell people about it until after Marjorie had died. And then one of the few people she mentioned it to was Gordon Barker. And Gordon made extensive use of it as a way of rounding out that part of Lowry's experience, which people had not talked about before. And it was one of the important parts of the biography. But unfortunately, he didn't acknowledge the text. I think the reason for that probably was that Jan had probably told him not to, that she had given him the manuscript on condition that perhaps that he not acknowledge its existence, because she wasn't too sure about what to do with it. But in the end, before she died, she decided to leave it in her literary collection at the New York Public Library, where it appeared and where Pat McCarthy spent quite a lot of time editing it and taking copies of it, and it became very much a part of an editing project that was carried out by people like Paul Thiessen, Miguel Motar, myself, and 1 or 2 others. Vic Doyen, of course, who died recently. And we put together 3 texts of the 1940 Under the Volcano, an edition of Swinging the Maelstrom, which Vicky edited, and again I did the annotations for all three. But the Jewel of the Crown was very, very much this lost novel, the In Ballast. So it's not a great novel, but it is a fascinating novel, and it certainly fills in a huge gap in Lowry's studies and testifies a lot to the kinds of things that he was interested in, and the way that his destiny as a writer was starting to shape itself. So I was very interested in this, and having had the chance to stay in Norway for about 6 weeks, I decided, well, let me, one or two things about Gordon's account of the trip didn't really make sense. Clearly, he had done what I think biographers are sometimes in danger of doing. That is, he had argued from the text to fill in the gaps in the life. And of course, that's dangerous because even if the novel was highly autobiographical, an author still basically fictionalizes much of his experience. And Lowry, God only knows, was a more compulsive liar than most. So there were things about the relationship with Nordahl Grieg, the Norwegian writer, who was such an important influence, and we'll talk about that a little later in the session. And they just weren't quite compatible. And I got to the point of realizing that by the time I'd spent a little time and traced the various parts of Norway where Lowry had been, that Gordon clearly had not done this. He had relied on the text of the manuscript, and as a result, I think things in the biography were distinctly wanting. So that was what provoked me into writing the essay, which we will talk about as basically. How does one go about annotating? How does one go about correcting record errors in the biographical record? And I think the idea that Andy and I have talked about is that he will ask me some various questions primarily about this new text in Ballast, but the implication being that the methodology or some of the implications of what we're saying will relate back to particularly to the Mexican experience and Under the Volcano in particular. So I'll try to find that kind of balance between the new and the old as we go. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's a great segue. One of the things, well, let's go to Nordahl Grieg, because one of the things that the actual meeting that Malcolm Lowry had with Nordahl Grieg turned out through your research to be very, very different from how he described it. So the actuality had very little to do with exactly the way that he fictionalized that. Maybe you could talk about how you discovered that they were very, very different.
Yes. Well, Lowry, to answer by indirection, many years before, Lowry, almost on impulse, had gone across the Atlantic to meet up with Conrad Aiken, a writer whom he had admired and who had written a novel called Blue Voyage, which Lowry learnt almost off by heart. And Lowry became quite a disciple of Aiken, and that was a relationship which had its ups and downs, but it continued for the rest of his life. A few years after that, while he was at Cambridge, he discovered in a bookshop in Liverpool, he discovered the Ship Sails On. It had only recently been translated, and he discovered in it, well, the way that he put it was, he discovered the novel that he had been trying to write, and suddenly felt that here was a mystical connection between this unknown Norwegian writer who was actually writing about him, Malcolm Lowry. And that sort of theme about identity of writer and creator became very, very much part of the texture of In Ballast. But Lowry had a chance to go to Norway. He signed on a ship, worked his passage over to Norway. He thought he was going to the White Sea. That's why In Ballast to the White Sea. Or he might have been going to Russia. It was one of those kind of, not exactly tramp steamers, but it picked up its cargo as it went, and they weren't quite sure where he was actually going. In the end, he ended up in a place called Ålesund, which is 200 or 300 miles north of Bergen on the west coast of Norway. And he stayed there for about 2 weeks and then basically was discharged and made his way to Oslo. And lo and behold, he met Nordahl Grieg. And according to Bauke, it was almost by a kind of a miraculous coincidence. On the day he arrived, he ended up at Grieg's place and they became fast friends, and they went to this and they went to that. They had meals together, and it's 90% bullshit, because it's Lowry imagining a kind of friendship on the basis of a meeting. The meeting did happen, but not as Gordon presents it in the book. So what I became concerned with was trying to track down the truth of this, because Grieg is such an important force in Lowry's writing that I think it's rather crucial to know exactly what the truth of the meeting was, as far as we can actually tell these things. So I set to work and tracked down quite a few things about it. And I discovered that the biography was incomplete in many ways, or unsatisfactory, or that Bauke tended to take Lowry at his own word as if this was the truth. And Lowry, as we know, was a rather compulsive liar or inventor, especially about his own life. And the result is that I think the Norwegian passage of Bauke's biography is very badly flawed. So one of the things I tried to do in this essay out of the Liverpool conference was try to make the corrections and try to correct the record in effect. Yeah.
So
Yep.
Yeah, I would say there we go. I never appreciated so much what an annotator does until meeting you, Chris. But then also the fact that you can go back to something that happened 100 years ago and pinpoint a date and time of an event. I think you pinpointed the date that they met. I think you pinpointed that his description of the shipyard with the flotsam and jetsam they used for ballast was probably not correct, that there were things that were wrong. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit, it's all related, but tell us a bit about the annotator's art. How do you pinpoint these types of things that to me sound like they would be, well, yeah. Actually, since you described the method, it's been astounding, but maybe you could talk, if you don't mind, a little bit about how an annotator can pinpoint these types of things that happened so long ago.
It's a question to which I don't have an easy answer, but it seems to me perhaps one good analogy for it is Marcel Proust, the recovery, the remembrance of lost time. Because what Proust does with that little magical moment, with the teacup and the margarita there, the Madeleine, sorry, suddenly the present is invested with a picture of the past, involuntary memory of the past. And it seems to me that one of the things that an annotator is trying to do, and of course it's an impossibility, is to identify the little critical problems almost as sort of lost moments, which perhaps can be, if you're lucky, can be recaptured and brought back to life. That's certainly part, I think, of the excitement I feel of annotation, the justification of it. I found this when I first went to Cuernavaca many, many years ago, probably in the 1980s. God, that's a long, long time ago. And I spent about 3 or 4 weeks in Cuernavaca. I just loved the city. It was much smaller then than it is now. And but I had time to go around the various locales in the book and to travel to other parts of Mexico and to get a feeling for the terrain. And that takes me to a question I think you were going to ask me about psychogeography. The argument is, to just forestall this question, is just, it seems to me very important in order to understand an author, you've got to try to understand the terrain. And that's a curious mixture of the geography and the psychology. And of course, it's an impossibility. How can we know about the experience of others? Well, that experience is translated into literature. We try to understand the literature. And so I think that the role of annotation is very, very much an attempt to facilitate that kind of understanding of a past that would otherwise be in danger of being lost. I found when I went to Mexico in the 1980s, many things mentioned in the novel had disappeared because, you know, time has a way of swallowing things up and changing these things. But I'm very glad I did go, because when I came back 10 or 12 years later, a lot more had gone. And so I was lucky in the sense I was able to record some of the things that otherwise completely would have disappeared. So you are, I think what an annotator is trying to do is to get some sense of the past and to try to make it alive and to make it part of a living tradition. I feel that's an important part of why I think it does matter. It is impossible. You very, very rarely get an annotation right. But I did have one. Shall I tell you about one that I did have right? I mentioned this in the essay. Lowry's dedication epigraphs at the beginning include one from John Bunyan, "Grace abounding to the chief of sinners." And I noticed, being a very smart young academic, that Lowry had misquoted Bunyan. So I thought, oh, well, I'm doing my annotation and companion to the book, I'll get this right. And so I wrote a very self-confident little entry and pointing out that Lowry had been careless in his transcription. And then by sheer luck, or mixture of luck and doing other things, I found William James, Varieties of Mystical Experience, Religious Experience. And lo and behold, William James had made the same error of transcription. And I thought, Lowry clearly was not quoting Bunyan, he is quoting William James. So that was an improvement on my initial hypothesis. And the word hypothesis, I think, is important because this is part of, if you like, a kind of scientific method of annotation. You make a hypothesis about a certain kind of problem. You identify the problem, you try to then to understand the context of relevant information, and you make a hypothesis about what the resolution of that problem is. It varies with different problems. Okay, well, I had a better hypothesis now. I had this entry, this epigraph was not from Bunyan, but from William James quoting Bunyan or misquoting Bunyan. And then I had the further satisfaction when I went for the first time to the Lowry collection, and some of his books from those days are still around in the collection there, including a copy of William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. Opened it up to check the copy and found it beautifully marked off with a piece of pencil. And I thought to myself, you cannot get much closer to an author's mind and intention than this. And I stress this because it's exceptional to find something as conclusive as that. Normally, when you are trying to recapture the past, it was kind of like a Proustian experience, because suddenly I felt for a moment I was in touch with the actual conditions of the writing and the forces that had brought this particular thing to the front. I remember too, at a later stage in those collections there, a similar kind of experience, which was again quite fascinating. And that is because Lowry always wanted a model for, he always wanted to write from something. He didn't invent things out of his own mind so much as take something else. Anyway, you'll recall at the beginning of Under the Volcano, there is a description of a swimming pool with a blood red sun reflected in the swimming pool. And it's got a reference to Lord Jim. You know, Lowry was fascinated by Conrad's novel, Lord Jim. And when Jim dies at the end of the novel, the sun is a sort of blood red sun. So that's clearly the literary reference. But I discovered Malcolm Lowry's little 1-foot ruler. You know, those little rulers that you use when you're underlining things. And it was inset with little pictures from Mexico. And one of those pictures was of a swimming pool with a red sun reflected in it. And I thought to myself, I mean, God, is this part of the annotation? Is this part of shall we say, the companion to the book? I found it a curiosity that basically even something like a literary allusion to Lord Jim was probably triggered or complemented by something as mundane and impossible normally. I mean, it was sheer luck that I found it, as a personal ruler with an inset little picture of a swimming pool in Mexico. I mean, it's it's these moments that realize that what you're trying to do in annotation is completely the impossible. You're trying to create a kind of platonic reality out of something that really is subject to all sorts of human failings. And so, but these are interesting examples. Anyway, coming back to the Norwegian experience, I found a number of things that I think were pertinent in this way, and I'll leave it to you to ask me about those, the ones that you think perhaps you'd like me to talk about. But the key one was the meeting with Grieg, because Bowker is a bit vague about it, and he kind of takes Lowry's own word about it, that Lowry came down by train from Ålesund, took a taxi almost immediately round to Grieg's place, met Grieg, was given a couple of whiskies, treated kindly, and basically that was the beginning of a long friendship. And Bowker goes on about talking about how they visited the Viking ships, which are really splendid, together, how they went out to the National Theatre and out for meals and became firm friends. And it's complete rubbish. Well, the meeting's not, because they did meet, but it wasn't when Lowry first arrived. Quite frankly, I think he was too scared, and it took him about a week to pluck up his courage. But then he finally did meet Grieg, and it was a turning point in his life. But it's not, as Bowker says. And this is how I discovered this. You might want to ask about this. Was what I call circumstantial evidence. This not circumstantial, but evidence from a circus. So,
circus.
Yeah. You were going to ask about that, did you? What were you going to ask about?
Just go ahead. There's something about the circus being in town in Oslo or whatever was pinpointed a date, I believe.
Yeah. Well, the question you asked me 10 minutes ago was about how do you pinpoint these things down? And the answer is a combination of hard work and luck. Sometimes you can do a lot of hard work and have no result. Sometimes you can just get lucky. But this one was sort of a consequence, I think, of deliberate hard work. I was trying to date the meeting with Grieg, and I had a hunch that it wasn't immediately, but I didn't know quite when. However, there's a consistent pattern in the novels like Dark as the Grave, in the manuscripts in the Vancouver collection, in the way that Lowry subsequently told the story in various letters. There's a kind of common thread, and after a while you learn to sort of get a feeling for what is likely to be true as opposed to what is likely to be fantasy. And that's quite important in the case of Lowry to have that kind of crap detector working. You know, you really do need, because Lowry does fantasize so much about his experience. Anyway, the truth of the matter seemed to be, first of all, that he had met Grieg, that Grieg did give him a couple of whiskies, and that it was on a night where there was a thunderstorm, and Lowry, after basically being politely, Grieg treated him well, politely, but basically had to get on with his work. He had to meet a deadline. And Lowry went out into the street where there was a thunderstorm going, and he made his way to the center of the town and to a bookshop where he picked up a copy of of Julian Green's The Dark Journey. And that account seems to be consistent and true and valid, happening directly as a consequence of the meeting with Grieg. And on the way to the bookshop, he passed a circus that was being set up for its opening the very next day. And I thought to myself, that's not the kind of thing that an author just invents, because Lowry actually talks about an ultramarine, about going to the circus. And so I got hold of all the newspapers for that time and worked through, and I found the ads for the circus. And sure enough, the first opening night, followed by a review the next day in the Oslo paper, was on September the 9th, which meant that quite clearly Lowry was, his meeting was just arrived in town the evening before, and that Lowry had passed the circus as it was being set up on the evening of the 8th after he'd been talking to Nordal Grieg. So it dated it to me, you know, with 99.9% assurance that this meeting took place on the 8th of September, which was about a week or 10 days after Gordon Barker had said so. In other words, Lowry had been in Oslo for at least a week before he had actually plucked up the nerve, I think, to meet with Grieg. And so it's a nice example of how a combination of a little bit of detective work and luck can actually lead to quite I think, a significant reader, because I think it's important in a biography to get such an important meeting to actually get the circumstances and the date right. And Gordon simply doesn't. And the consequence of that is it was just a few days before Lowry obviously left to go back to Cambridge. And so therefore, all the things that he says in Dark as the Grave and other works about how they became friends and how Gordon Barker talks about how they visited the Viking ships together, how they had went out for lunch, and the things that are in the novel in Ballas about where Ericsson becomes a friend of Sigbjorn at the end of the novel. This is complete fabrication. It didn't happen. It's not autobiographical. It's part of Lowry's imagined experience and why Grieg was so important to Lowry, but it didn't actually happen in life. So it's a matter of trying to get the facts right to play off the literature against the biography.
Yeah, that's amazing stuff. That kind of stuff gives me goosebumps when I think about it. Now, Dany, how are we doing for time?
Oh, we are fine. If you there's one question from the internet, but if you go ahead and I'll send you the question, you will have a look at it if you want, right?
Oh, I can go on forever.
Yeah, I know, because I think I could too. So, well, one of the things, and Dany, maybe before we take that question, could you bring up that picture of Nordahl Grieg? Because it sort of ties into the next question I was going to ask Chris. English speakers, probably Spanish speakers too, we don't know much about Nordahl Grieg. I don't know anything really except from what I've heard from you, Chris, and then I've done a little bit of research. Could you talk a bit about who he was and then what kind of influence do you think that he's had on Lowry's writing? Yes, it's an important question, I think. One of the things I managed to do in Norway was to teach myself to read Norwegian. I can't speak it, and if somebody speaks it to me or I watch a Norwegian film, I just pick up a few words. It's a hard language to actually listen to, but I did learn to read it, and I did that by reading Grieg, The Ship Sails On, in the original, and a few other things too. He's a very, very good writer. Very much to the left, communist at one point, although not technically, he didn't actually join the Communist Party. But he had a very exciting life. He was a correspondent for journals. Lowry sort of mentions him indirectly in Under the Volcano, because when Hugh goes out to the Far East, he basically passes the coast of China where there is a war on. And he didn't discover until later that Nordahl Grieg was in China as a war correspondent at that time. And that becomes relevant because one of the things that Gordon Barker says is that Lowry didn't have a photograph of Grieg and got it off the back of a book called Chinese Days, which was Grieg's record of his trip to China. And he says that he got it from the book flap. Now, can I show you something on my screen? I've got a picture of Grieg on mine. Can I show you this book? This is, yeah. Now, can you see the book I'm holding up? There's no, the thing is, there's no cover on it. The photograph that Barker's talking about is something in the middle of the book here with Nordahl Grieg tucked up in the corner there. It's not a very clear photo at all. But again, it was just a matter of correcting the record. But Lowry did have a knack for amazing coincidences. He met somebody in Ålesund, where the little town where the ship arrived. He in a coffee shop, he met a teacher who happened to be reading this book about Grieg's Chinese Days. And I think they spent quite a lot of time together as admirers of Grieg. Why
Grieg, I think, is a fine writer. He was a dramatist, a novelist. The Ship Sails On, I think, is an excellent novel. It was the kind of novel that I think Lowry was trying to write in ultramarine. It caused Lowry a certain amount of dissatisfaction because he felt ultramarine, as it was written in the early 1930s, didn't really match up to either Aiken's Blue Voyage or Nordell's Ship Sails On. So one of the things he did was that the ultramarine started to become full of allusions to Grieg, including the translation of some of Grieg's poetry. Now, Lowry's Norwegian was not good enough to translate Grieg, and there was no English translation available. So how did this poetry come to be translated? And I think the answer has to be, it was the school teacher that he met when he was in this little town of Osland, who obviously translated it for him. Anyway, these are the kinds of questions that occur. Grieg's important because he was a fixture in Lowry's imagination. If you recall in Under the Volcano, there's the consul reads about a character called William Eriksson, who's found at the bottom of a barranca. And the name Eriksson was the fictional name that Lowry had used for the character in Ballast to the White Sea. So Lowry really felt there was a kind of a curious psychic coincidence that was linking him to the destiny to him and Nordell Grieg. I'm quite sure Nordell Grieg did not think the same way at all. So it was a very one-sided kind of discipleship. But Grieg's a good writer, and Lowry chose well, I think.
I'm gonna, since I've read your article, I'm gonna look him up, at least the Ship Sails On, and see on your recommendation. You've never steered me wrong so far, Chris, so I don't think
it's a good novel. Yeah, yeah.
I think we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I thought, why don't we take those now, and then we'll finish up with some of the things that you and I talked about. So go ahead, Dany and Alberto. Or I can read them.
Yeah.
If you want. All right, so what?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy. You have the question.
Well, one of the questions is from Michael Romer. He says, can any trust be put in the portrayal of Lowry's friend, Fernando, as Dr. Vigil, given that Grieg and Eriksson's relationships were so different?
I think the short answer is yes, with some question marks, because he certainly did meet somebody when he was in Oaxaca who was quite a remarkable figure, and clearly the whole premise of Dark as the Grave is going back to Mexico to meet this figure again, and so there was some reality to this figure. What was part of Lowry's Mexican life, obviously embellished by imagination and turned into a sort of dramatic figure. But again, Lowry works with something like that is part of his experience, and then it becomes sort of transformed by imagination into something richer and stranger. So I think you could say the similar sort of process is going on with both the figures, and that if we get to the end with this little shot of the Samaritan or the strange boat, that will perhaps explain a little bit more about that process. Yeah.
Alberto, did you have a question?
Yes, Dan. Yes, Andy. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions for our friend Chris. The first one is, Chris, you have mentioned that Gordon Bowker's biography has some mistakes in it. What do you think about the necessity of having a brand new biography of Malcolm Lowry? And do you think Douglas Day should be also deleted, his biography, from the libraries, or what do you think? That's the first question. Let me please make another one. It's about La Mordida. You collaborated also in editing this extraordinary book for the translation of La Mordida into Spanish. Do you think it would be best translating it as it is, with all the whole things of annotations and lots of quotes and things like that? Or do you think the translator should do something like editing it a bit so that you can have a straight storyline or something like that? Those are the questions. Thank you.
There has been an edition made of it by Pat McCarthy, who had exactly that kind of problem and had to work out a kind of compromise between the two options that you've given there. When you've got a manuscript that's in a mess, it is always a bit of a problem as to whether you present the mess or you try to sort of straighten it out. And so again, I'm not sure there's an easy answer. We had that problem, of course, with In Ballast, because it's unfinished. In the last chapter, chapter 18, there were about 3 or 4 different versions of it. And what were we to do? Were we to select one version and call it the correct version, or do what Pat did, which was to present alternative versions that Jan Gabrielle had, and then rely on my annotations to basically explore the further dimensions? It's a problem. And I mean, from a literary point of view, In Ballast is not a very satisfactory novel because it didn't actually get finished. But I think it is part of the fascination of it as a book is to see that unfinished quality and to see the options that Lowry was actually contemplating, but it doesn't make it into a well-made novel that comes to a nice, happy conclusion. So no, listen, I don't know what the answer would be if you were doing it in Spanish, Alberto. It would just have to be I honestly don't know. Part of the answer would be a scholarly edition which presents all the different versions, but that's not always very satisfactory from a reading point of view. Genetic criticism is very much sort of in vogue, but one of the problems with genetic criticism is that that it often leads to, shall we say, the trials and errors and discards being regarded as equally as important as shall we say, a reading text. It's an argument to which there's no easy resolution.
What about the biographies?
Oh, the biographies, yeah. Well, I think, Douglas Day and Gordon, both those biographies have got a lot of very, very good things in them. They have. But I think it would be very useful at some point if somebody was to write a kind of, shall we say, a literary biography. Because Gordon was a sociologist. He was not a scholar of literature. And what he does is he documents very faithfully all the drinks that Lowry took and the drunken behavior and all those sorts of things. But he doesn't easily relate it to the actual production of the text and the actual, shall we say, the literary significance of the text. I had a friend a few years ago who did a literary biography of Virginia Woolf, and it was quite different. It did not ignore her life, but it did not pretend to be a biography as such. It was more a kind of chronological treatment of the imaginative life as revealed in the literature, which is rather different from the actual facts, which, in many ways between them, I think Gordon particularly, but Douglas Day, even though he gets things wrong, a lot of the facts I think are quite well known. But what hasn't been done and what could be done would be something of a literary biography where shall we say, the writing was much, much more of the focus. Douglas Day tried to do this, but it was early stages and there were a lot of things that just simply he didn't know or chose to do differently. But no, so a literary biography, I think would be actually a huge need for. It'd be a very good thing to have.
Well, Chris, now that you're retired, it seems like perfect timing. I don't know.
Well, it could be tempting, actually, I must say. Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure we talk about this. One of my favorite episodes of annotation. And maybe, Dany, you could bring up the picture of the tomb of Lalla Rookh.
Oh, yes.
Well, yeah, because it was only the story of the consul's, his Anglo-Indian parents, right? Was only really a very short little bit, but I was impressed nevertheless. you know, by the description of the watercolors, and then what you discovered about that was astounding. So could you tell us a bit about how you discovered this and realized that it had been the inspiration for basically that whole segment of the story?
Yeah, yes, well, this is quite fascinating too. Remember, this was a long time ago in the 1980s, before computers were invented, God help us. And so the internet did not exist. And you know, nowadays, if you find something, you can spend half an hour on the computer and try this, try that, and do something like about sort of 6 months work in the library for finding things. This was not possible in those days. And when I did the original companion, I had to do it the hard way. And I was aware from the manuscripts in Vancouver that suddenly, and you know, all these references to Kashmir appeared, and there was basically associations between the father disappearing into the Himalayan mountains and the volcanoes in Mexico, and a lot of, he talks about, for instance, turban trees when Hugh and Yvonne go to for the ride there. They passed these big tall trees, which reminded Hugh of the trees that he had seen in Kashmir. But I think the most outrageous one of all was the consul at one point talking with Yvonne, looks around his bungalow at these watercolors that are on the wall, painted by his mother. Well, fine, scenes from Kashmir, such as this one here, which is the first one mentioned, the tomb of Lala Rookh. It turned out to be an actual photograph. It was in a book by Francis Young Husband about Kashmir. And the paintings were by somebody by the name of Major General Molyneux, or Edward Molyneux, who, and there's probably about 20 or 30 of them through the book. And so Lowry has basically very outrageously plagiarized these paintings from the book. He refers to about half a dozen of them altogether and attributed them as watercolors painted by his mother. Now, I was aware that all this material had entered the text sometime in the early 1940s in the process of revision. So I suspected, because it was so precise, like the consul's dream at the beginning of chapter 5, where he has this strange hangover and he wakes up, but it's a dream that's full of Indian Kashmiri references. So the question was, where did these come from? Because, as I say, Lowry doesn't work just out of his own creative imagination. And so I tried, when I was in Vancouver, in vain to sort of look for books on Kashmir. But I was over in England and I went to the library in Cambridge, one of the biggest libraries it's one of the ones to get which is copies of everything. And I sat down with those days with a great big catalogue. It wasn't on computer. It was just a huge big file on basically alphabetical, all works on Kashmir. And it took me the best part of a day to go through these hundreds and hundreds of entries on books of Kashmir and try to identify something that seemed likely. And at one point I found this one and I just thought, I wonder, this description of the book about somebody's investigations into Kashmir with paintings by, and so I got it, checked it out, and it was one of those moments like an epiphany or a Proustian moment or something like that. Wow, here they are. Now, I had not expected to find the paintings. I had expected to find some references to Kashmir, but lo and behold, it turned out that there were dozens of allusions from this book that had been made their way into the text, including these references to the paintings. Now, it was the sort of thing that's a wee bit easier now because, you know, a lot of these books can be called up, early books can be called up on Google, so you can spend a day possibly just going through. But in this case, it probably took me the equivalent of 3 or 4 weeks of work in Vancouver without much luck, and finally in Cambridge where I did get it there. So yeah, the discovery was actually very satisfying. And again, what it seems to be doing is, as I say, this recovery of past moments. It was that kind of illumination. It just showed me how Lowry's imagination was working. And you can actually see on the website, not only this one, but another half a dozen there, which have got my annotations to them about the way that these have been used in different parts of the text. Yeah, it's a very good example, Andy, so thanks for raising it.
Well, and that's a beautiful book too. I don't own it, but boy, I recommend it. The Kashmir by Francis Younghusband with watercolors by that Major Molyneux. It's beautiful.
It's a good book. Yeah.
Well, finally, and then we can go to some different questions. The last thing is there was a phrase that you picked up in your most recent essay, and I quote, "the unimaginable library of the dead." And I was like, there's got to be more to it that you understand that maybe I'm not 100% appreciating, maybe our audience isn't.
Yes. Now, this takes me into the fields of somewhat woolly mysticism. And let me just try to preface that by saying, Lowry, of course, as we know, had his mystical and spiritual sort of crazy notions at times. But Lowry was also very much a close realist as well. And it seems to me that, to generalize, and this applies to writers like Nabokov and Joyce and Beckett and a lot of the modernist writers, one of the curiosities about modernism is the strange kind of blending of, to use Lowry's terms, sort of very, very accurate gutters with the kind of the spiritual visions that arise from them. And in Lowry's case, I think that kind of opposition of the shall we say, very Aristotelian everyday and the very Platonic ideal, that notion of the real and the mystical is they really are played off against each other. Under the Volcano, I think, is a classic example of a book that is absolutely faithful to the details of Mexico and other experiences. And yet at the same time, it has that kind of crying out for a wider, transcendent, mystical kind of consideration. And at one point, remember that one of the books that's important to Under the Volcano is Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. And the consul at one point says something about everything is to be found in Peter Rabbit. And you think about the jacket, which of course causes the consul's death, and the garden theme of Peter Rabbit and the transgression and everything like that. But what the consul also says is that basically he mentions in the same breath Peter Rabbit and Moby Dick. And of course, we know that Moby Dick was also hugely important to, Melville was important to Lowry. The whole White Whale, the whole experience of that novel was just there. Now, how can the two be related together? And the answer is, probably Lowry's the first ever to basically talk about them in the same sentence, or the consul was. But the idea, I think, behind this notion of the unimaginable library of the dead, which is a phrase that Lowry used in a poem where he was talking about past authors and about writers who had left traces and influences. And this is, as I say, where we get into slightly mystical territory, but I'm fascinated by it because I think there's a very pragmatic element to it as well. Lowry's notion was that you've got this sort of Platonic library. And if you think of a writer like the Argentine writer Borges, who's one of the geniuses of the past century. I think he's just one of the great writers of all time. But one of his themes is the universal library. And that's a kind of, if you like, a Platonic library in which everything is stored. Everything that everyone has written is somewhere in that universal library. And the result of that means that if you think about the metaphor, you've got lots of dark corners, you've got books that have got that are rotting and will never be found again, but you've also got discoveries that can be made of things that have been put in that library and have not been known. So if you think about sort of, if you like, the tradition of literature as a kind of huge, as a work that is part of a huge big library, then you find basically it is quite possible for Peter Rabbit and Moby Dick to be side by side in that rabbit in such a library, or to be taken from different shelves in that library and brought together through some kind of connection, the way that Lowry has done it. in other words, that, and I think this is quite important because, you know, Lowry has been accused of plagiarism, and he was a compulsive borrower of things from everywhere. But it occurred to me that this, actually a lot of that is explained, and I think justified in a very, very interesting way, that what Lowry was very interested in doing, as well as describing, you know, shall we say, with great accuracy, the gutters of everyday Mexico with complete fidelity. But at the same time, he was also interested in looking at, shall we say, the way that they related to everything else that everybody else had written. And this, therefore, this metaphor of the library, in which basically all books can be stored and related to one another, and these kind of mystical threads that lead out. I think it explains a lot about Lowry's practice of borrowing, so that basically he's not so much plagiarizing as forming a kind of an alliance, a spiritual, invisible alliance between his novel and whatever it is he's referring to. And this was particularly important, I think, with Conrad Aiken's Blue Voyage and Nordal Grieg's As Ship Sails On, because he wanted his voyage to be really part of those voyages too. And Moby Dick, for that reason, part of Melville's voyage. And so one way of looking at that is not just simply as a kind of, shall we say, dull plagiarism or literary plagiarism, as a kind of a vision of a sense of, shall we say, sheer destiny, or of human destiny. Or so. I want to be careful with my words here, because otherwise it sounds like I'm saying sort of wishy-washy, you know, rubbish, and mystical rubbish. And I don't want that to be the implication at all. But I think at a certain point of your life, you know, you start off as being, shall we say, an Aristotelian, where you affirm the primacy of the visible, tangible world. But I think as you get older, possibly too, you start wondering whether, well, you've got Aristotle on one hand, but you've also got Plato on the other, with that the reality of the world of ideas. And I think the human mind, if you like, is conditioned in such a way as we somehow exist somewhere between the two. We're not just simply creatures of the gutter. We do have aspirations. We want to climb to the top of the mountain, or the top of the volcano. But at the same time, we don't live on the top of the volcano too, because we have to come back to the gutters at times. So that sense of sort of somehow being between the here and the now and the transcendent is something that I think is absolutely crucial to Lowry's whole way of thinking. And that it seemed to me that, again, part of what and this is probably quite a good note to sort of round the discussion off, what Lowry's doing in many ways is actually very, very similar to what Proust was doing. When I talked about that sort of way, the evocation of the past comes back through involuntary memory, but it comes back in its immense reality, and a lost world for a moment is regained through imagination. And it does seem to me that, well, what I'm trying to do in my annotation, ideally, is to create something of that kind of effect, and seeing that kind of something that goes beyond just simply the literal description. So it's a complex theme, and I don't know if that's the answer you were wanting, Andy, or if it's helped at all.
No, that makes sense.
But I think it's a crucial metaphor for Lowry, as it was for Borges.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we have any more questions from the audience, or I think we maybe wanted to finish on the note about the SS Samaritan.
Oh yes, that's quite a good one, that one. Yeah. It's put down. This is just a curiosity, that one. Can we get the picture up?
Andy, do you want to put the picture of the ship?
Yeah. I'm on.
Yeah. Well, Lowry talks about, or the consul talks about, beg your pardon, at some point in the book, about this picture of the Samaritan, the boat that was sunk. And he makes a comment about, so I left behind me part of our antipodes. You can see that's the first line in the Gothic German there, unsere Antipoden. And he talked about the Samaritan, a Q ship, as being disguised with camouflage painting. And well, not quite by luck. in Dark as the Grave, there's a mention which sort of provoked my curiosity, because this is not in the original companion. This is something I found later. But Lowry talks about being in a place in Mexico City called the Muncher Kindel, a German sort of kitchen, a restaurant where they sold German beer, which apparently did exist but no longer does. And he picked up a magazine with this photo of a ship, basically that had been sunk by a German U-boat. And I was curious about this. And I tried to locate the magazine. It seemed, I wondered what sort of magazine this could be. Anyway, by sheer luck, I found something else that had intrigued me. There was a German adventurer by the name of Count Felix von Lochner who sailed a ship to New Zealand, which New Zealand, of course, from England, are the Antipodes. And Lowry had a mystical thing about the Antipodes. And that word Antipodes, I think, is a key word here. And what happened was that he was an adventurer, but my ex-father-in-law was actually a radio operator on his ship, and then got sort of basically stranded in New Zealand. So I was curious about this Count Felix von Lochner, who's a bit of a romantic, dashing figure. But one of the things he was up to was he was actually spying on behalf of the German Nazis, just basically adventure trip that was also part of a kind of a spying thing. He'd done this in World War I. He did it again before World War II. And anyway, he wrote a book of his memoirs, and this basically is the ship that's mentioned. And and so, amazingly, Lowry must have got a picture of this from the book that came out in the early 1920s with this illustration of the camouflage of the ship and the way that the ship disguised itself like this before it would attack and sink other shipping in the Indian Ocean. So the Antipodes have moved a bit, but yeah. And Lowry obviously was attracted by the notion of the word Antipodes, and therefore incorporated as part of the description of the Samaritan this kind of story of the German adventurer who had basically sailed on a ship which was camouflaged in this strange zebra type sort of way. It's a very, very odd. It's a curiosity, really, which is one of the reasons I was so attracted by it. Again, it just goes to show that there's all these loose ends in Lowry. You think you've got it completely annotated, and you find that no, there's always something more. And there we go. There is something more. Yeah.
Well, yeah, nobody's probably regretting that more than Gordon Bowker.
Well, Gordon unfortunately died earlier this year at the beginning of this year.
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
And I had to change my essay a little bit because I didn't want to. I got on for a while. I got on all right with Gordon, but I had to just make a little footnote in the essay to the effect that I was not trying to pick a quarrel with somebody or somebody who had died, but rather it was a quarrel. But shall we say it was a dispute based on an academic and scholarly grounds. He was a funny man, Gordon, but he did do a lot of good stuff too.
Well, I don't know if we have any more questions from the audience. Any? I don't see any more, but there's no reason why people can't
There's
ask
one
questions.
question.
Yeah.
The one question from Brian Biggs. And
Brian, yeah.
He's saying, there were British dazzle ships painted in Liverpool docks in World War I. Would Lowry have seen this as a young boy?
Yes, he had. He was actually taken by his brother, older brother, I think it was Stuart, to visit one of these Q ships that had been in harbour and was being refurnished. So yes, he actually did go and saw one of these things actually in Liverpool I'm not sure if it was during the war or just after, but yes, it was certainly something that, again, this notion of the Q-boats had basically seized his imagination. He had been actually on board one when it was in dock. Yeah, he of course, it's a bit impossible because the range of these ships that left Liverpool was the base for them. The range was really between, shall we say, a triangle between Liverpool, Gibraltar, and New York. And Lowry has it, of course, that he sort of basically places the boat in the Pacific, which it just in real life could not have been. No. So that's an example of a violation of the, shall we say, the reality in order to, oh, I don't know, create a thematic point. But yes, no, he had actually seen one of these ships. He had been on board one. Yes.
Great question.
Yeah. While Brian's on the thing there too, it's probably a good idea to compliment him and Helen on that volume that they did, a beautiful little volume of essays, but also the very, very good work that they're doing in Liverpool, making Liverpool a centre of Lowry studies, very much to complement the archives in Vancouver, which of course can't be replaced, and the wonderful work that's been done by Alberto and Dany and people in Mexico. So we've got a nice little triangulation between Mexico, Vancouver, and Liverpool, which I hope actually testifies to a good future. Brian, as I understand it, he can probably clarify this when he talks tomorrow, is interested in creating a kind of a centre at the Blue Coat for Lowry material. I was actually hoping to be over there earlier this year, but the pandemic put a sort of a stop to that. But I've got, as I say, a host of books and Lowry features, like, for instance, you can see this bottle of mezcal with the devil on it. Alberto will remember this because actually, you remember Alberto? You bought it with...
Yes, Anís del Mono, Anís del Mono. Anís.
But these are the kinds of things like this, and a lot of these books, like these Chinese Days by Grieg and things like that, they're no good to my children. So I'm hoping to donate them to the Blue Coat and to a Lowry Centre in Liverpool. So I hope that project is still going, but it was very much put on hold by the pandemic, which could muck things up for the next year or two, the way it's going to. So my sympathies, we're relatively free of it in New Zealand, but my sympathies to Mexico and to England and, of course, to the United States, where things are just really taking on horrific dimensions. So that's a very sad note to end on, but the voyage will go on. Yeah.
As Nordal Grieg said, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, Dany, so I guess that concludes our session. Do I hand it over to Marcelo Texeira?
Yeah, very nice conversation. And let me see if there's some other comments. To Brian say, we are hoping that Liverpool John Moores University will host a Lowry archive here. Once again, Brian said, we are hoping that Liverpool John Moores University will host a Lowry archive here.
Yeah, well.
I didn't pick up the last phrase. Archive. Oh, archives. Yeah. Yes. I hope so too. Yes, it's a good place to have it. Yes, indeed. And as I say, I hope to give a lot of my material to it.
All right, and Óscar say hi, and he had to go out from the session, but he's looking on the Facebook page.
Oh,
good.
Well, Alberto, have you something to add?
No, thank you very much to our friend Chris Ackerley. It's a fantastic session, a fantastic conversation.
It's been a pleasure, Alberto. Thank you for persuading me to do it.
Thank you very much to you, Andy, also. And I hope next year we can get together again. A big hug for you too.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Remember this, where I met Andy was at that conference. What year was it, Andy? It was many years ago now.
Was that 2002?
Something of the kind, yeah. And I still remember that night before we went out to the cemetery after the talk was over, sitting there talking and drinking mezcal. It was sort of basically sponsored by somebody. And I must have drank, I think, 2 or 3 dozen mezcals. It was, what was wonderful about it was that I was completely sober the next morning. I don't know why. I shouldn't have been, but it was a wonderful, wonderful conference and a wonderful experience. So yes, let's have another one sometime when this horrible bug gets out of the way.
Yeah.
Yes, but we didn't drink that much.
Well, I did. Yeah. But for some reason, you know, sometimes you get lucky. Yeah.
All right, and in Facebook, Israel Lopez said it was a great talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
And Janet Cooper said, great start. Thanks to all, and see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
And Brian is ending with, we are looking forward to seeing Chris material in Liverpool one day.
I hope so, yes. As I said, I had intended to be there this year, but that didn't work out. Yeah. Okay.
Well, great. It was a very good first day.
Yeah, thank you, Dany. Yes.
Very good first day. Congratulations to all of you. And thank you very much for being here. I think we are seeing tomorrow 3 p.m. Mexican time. Mañana nos vemos a las 3 de la tarde. Para todos, muchas gracias por habernos escuchado y nos